So today I am walking through the process from SketchUp into Unity 3D, which will then build out to virtual reality. This rollout on the left will let you go to any place in the video that you'd like. And this is just going to be a fast-forwarded walkthrough of what I'm doing to get these SketchUp files into Unity and get them clean and nice and ready for virtual reality. So this is the SketchUp file. And I start out by orienting all of the normals. And a lot of people don't know that this actually is something that SketchUp can do. What I did is I turned the edge style and the face style to monochrome, and that allows me to see which faces are actually flipped. And when you import this into another program, these faces will actually be invisible, so you won't see them at all, and you'll be wondering where that geometry went. So I turned on monochrome, and now I'm flying around the model and figuring out which faces are inverted, and I'm flipping them. I'm also doing some general cleanup. This is an old file of a house I worked on about 6 years ago when I was learning SketchUp, and I picked this because it's a particularly messy file, and it'll give you a good idea of the cleanup required for these SketchUp files. I draw these section boxes and systematically go through and flip the normals of all of these different items. To flip the normals, I'm just selecting on the faces and then right-clicking and doing a reverse face, and that once it shows white within monochrome, you know you have done it successfully. What I just did was I turned my face style to show all of the back faces red, and it's an easier way to see what's inverted and what is properly oriented. I highly recommend using the section boxes. It makes it quite easy to see what's going on. All right, next, I'm texturing these faces again. When you reverse faces, often the textures won't come through. So I'm just taking the paint bucket and retexturing all of these items. I like to texture in SketchUp first because it'll translate into 3ds Max, and you'll be able to sort and select and organize by those materials. So I do recommend keeping the materiality of your SketchUp model fairly, if not accurate, organized, so you'll be able to use that organization later. I also wouldn't worry about total photorealism with these textures within SketchUp, because once we're in 3ds Max, I usually switch these out for higher resolution textures anyway. I just made a ground plane, which is easier for the walkthroughs once you're in virtual reality. It's nice not to fall off the map, and I just recommend a general ground plane if you don't have that on your model already. You can see what I'm doing now is I'm flying around and looking for any sort of Z-fighting. That's where two faces overlap each other. And in SketchUp you get this flashing, and you'll actually get that in Unity as well. And it's very disorienting once you're in virtual reality to see this flashing. And so generally that's just from messy modeling, which in this file is a lot of the windows. So I'm going through and deleting the faces that are overlapping, and then just making one dominant. And you can see it was pretty tricky on some of this because I didn't do groups properly when I was learning, and a lot of the mesh is just overlapping on the same layer, and it's generally a nightmare. And now I'm building a specific group just for all the glass. For occlusion culling and for general materials, I like to have all my glass on one layer or one object, especially going into Unity. So I'm just creating all these glass planes individually under one group and giving them all the same material. And it'll just be easier later on to sort. Honestly, if you're working with a big file, I wouldn't worry about this step, but this was a small house, so I could do this relatively quickly. I'm also making these rectangles three-dimensional. I'm giving them a little bit of depth, and that allows me to have true double-sided faces within Unity, so you can see the glass from both sides. I'm purging my file now, which I highly recommend doing. That will really limit file size when you export. And then I just back-saved into SketchUp 8, and that will allow you to import it into 3ds Max natively. If you have SketchUp 2013 or 2014 as the file, you'll get an error when you try to import into 3ds Max. So you want to back-save to 8 and then do the native import into 3ds Max. I'm just checking the integrity of this file and making sure everything came through. And you can see that I also turned on polygon count to see how heavy the file is. So now is a very laborious process of going through and doing texturing within Max. This really comes down to how photorealistic you want your file to be for the VR walkthrough. But I have some huge library from Andrew Price of really nice sort of full high-res textures. And in Max, I tend to go through most of the primary elements of the building and replace a lot of the SketchUp textures with these very realistic, high-resolution textures. What's nice about this package I got from Andrew Price is they come with normal maps and specular maps. You can see as I'm sorting through, I have a whole bunch of options with a lot of great maps. That was through the Architecture Academy, and I highly recommend checking out that entire suite. And this can really be as detailed or as long as you want. In general, I like the 3K textures because I can have them as high resolution as I want depending on the hardware for the final walkthrough. And I use Max instead of SketchUp because of its UV mapping, and when I want to get really detailed with any specific element, I can go in and actually tweak the UV maps and get them just the way I want before exporting. As I'm doing right here with the tiling, I want the seams to line up with the wood floor edges, and so I do a bit of tweaking here to get those to orient nicely. Another note is SketchUp imports all of these materials as standard materials. If you're importing from another program like Revit, you might have Autodesk materials, and you are going to need to download a plugin or do it manually to get standard materials. That was my computer crashing and me booting up again. And what I'm about to do with some of these textures is I didn't have all of the textures in-house on my machine, so I use CG textures a lot to grab any other textures I might need. So in a second here, you'll see me go there. Alright, so another reason I like to use Max is it'll get rid of any stray lines. You can see here I'm selecting just the shapes in the entire file and deleting them, and then what that will do is get rid of any stray edges or points that aren't attached to faces, which just cleans it up a little bit better. Now what I'm doing is creating selection sets, and this is the best way to export your files. So I recommend selecting various elements of the geometry by their properties like walls, floors, windows, creating selection sets, and then exporting them as FBXs. If anyone's interested, I can upload my FBX settings, but really the only thing to note is that you want to export selected based on your selection sets, and then literally just hide them when you're done so that you keep your file organized. I also recommend embedding your textures and all of your media so that the FBX file is self-contained and has the textures inside of it that you need. You can also see that as I go through this, I'm finding a couple of little things that I forgot and decide to tackle while I'm exporting this file. The reason I like using selection sets is that if you ever need to make an edit or there's something off, you can just toggle on that one selection set, edit whatever you need to in it. Like I'm doing right here, I'm adding a counter material to this counter, and then you can re-export it, and your file will be the same when you bring it into Unity. So it's a nice way to, if you have an edit, to just do that within the selection set, and then you get the exact same export next time you export. And now that everything is exported, I noticed that these solar panels were rather heavy. There was way too much geometry attached to them. I think there was like 8,000 polys just for these simple planes. So I'm going through now and doing a bit of mesh compression. You can see that not all of these are instances of each other, so I'm creating an array so that they will all become instances of that same component. And then I'm going to go in and compress that component. I'm going to run a pro optimizer on it, which will just cut the mesh in half, in a sense, and then just run the UV textures on top of it so that you get a much lighter file. It doesn't look great, but at the same time, you're never going to see this in a VR walkthrough, so I managed to cut the polygon count in half running that optimization. And now to Unity. So I'm creating this file. I'm going to import those FBXs into a mesh folder and drag them all into the scene, into the project hierarchy to put them all at their origin so they all line up. So the nice part about doing these smaller components is they generally load faster. You want to set the scale factor to 0.0254 and also generate light map UVs. And then it'll be true to scale and ready to go. I'm tweaking a couple of these textures because they came in a little transparent, just set them to diffuse. I'm adding lighting. Directional lighting plays a huge role in architectural visualization, so I recommend getting that position right. You'll see I tinker with that a lot. And then on the north side, it's a little dark, so I'm adding a small little light to cheat. And I'm making all the glass transparent, so when light baking happens, the light will bounce accurately. And then adjusting the light a little more so it's a nice condition inside. Loading in my Oculus drivers, which right now is 0.4.1, adding my player controller. And as you can see, I tested it out, and it would be good to go right now. There's still a lot of tweaks to be done, but honestly, at this point, you could build it out and have a somewhat workable VR file. Now I'm sprucing up the textures a bit. Because I have these nice textures from Andrew Price, I'm able to add these normal maps and get some nice bump textures into this file. Wood in general is also specular, so after you add the bump map, I would also add some shine to it so you get a more realistic texture. Also, you want to make your texture size bigger. Because I'm using relatively large JPEGs for my textures, I make the max size of these much larger. And again, tiles are going to be a little shiny. Adding those bump maps, make sure you set that bump map to be a normal texture. Otherwise, you're not going to get a good result. With VR, you want to have your anti-aliasing pumped all the way up. This is going to be incredibly computationally expensive, but the higher the anti-aliasing, the better quality walkthrough you're going to have. So you can see I bumped that up and made my textures max resolution, and generally put all the settings at max. And if your computer can handle it, I recommend doing that as much as possible, because VR is really going to be only the best if you can do those settings. I'm also adding a couple sort of cheap lights inside to simulate more daylight coming through. Even with good light bouncing, it's still pretty dark on interiors, so a couple point lights will go a long way. And this was my failed attempt at starting a greenhouse. I realized for this demo I wouldn't take the time to do vegetation. And then you're going to want to make light map statics for all of these objects, and make occluder and occludee statics for occlusion culling, and then do light baking. You can see I can post these settings later. These are pretty standard settings. Light map extended is great. You get much more fine control. But honestly, just make sure you got a lot of bounces happening and some boosts. And after a couple hours, this is what the file looks like. So you can hide your lights because that's all baked in. And then you're pretty much set to go. I highly recommend putting on occlusion culling. That will sort of hide the meshes that aren't visible by the camera when they're not in view. I would make the smallest occluder smaller than the default, especially for these smaller scenes. And you'll see here I'm testing to make sure it works by rotating the camera a bit. This makes a huge difference in the overall performance of these demos. And that's the process. From there you can make sure your quality settings are maxed out. Again, like I was saying, that really matters for comfort within VR, as well as sort of at these lower resolutions, giving the best experience. Also making sure that they run at 75 frames per second, but that will be another video. and then building it for your desired platform. Holding down Control while clicking on the executable will bring up your settings. I'm just setting this so the screen recorder can see it. And that is the entire workflow from start to finish. I cut a bunch of parts, but it took me about 5 hours. And it wouldn't be a complete workflow without this crash right at the end of the video. But thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.